There is a box sitting on my kitchen table right now. It has been sitting there for 3 days. Maggie keeps walking past it without saying anything, which is her way of saying plenty. It is a cardboard box, old enough that the corners have gone soft. The kind of box that was never meant to last this long. Inside it are folders, printed emails, handwritten notes, carbon copies of contracts that nobody uses anymore. The paper has gone yellow in places. Some of it smells like the old office on Meridian Street. That particular mixture of burnt coffee and copy machine toner that I spent 41 years breathing in without thinking about it. I pulled that box down from the top shelf of the garage closet about 3 days ago. I had to move 2 of Maggie's holiday wreaths and a broken shop light to get to it. I stood on a step stool that I probably should not have been standing on at 65, reached up into the dark, and felt the familiar weight of it before I could even see it. I knew exactly what it was. I had not touched it in 15 years, but I knew. It is nearly midnight now. The rest of the house is quiet. Maggie went to bed an hour ago, or at least she went upstairs. Whether she is sleeping is another question. The kitchen light above the table casts everything in that particular shade of yellow that only exists late at night. The kind of light that makes the world feel smaller and somehow more honest than it does in the daytime. I am 65 years old. I worked as a structural engineer for 41 years. I built things, or rather, I made sure things were built correctly, which is a different job than most people imagine. It is not a glamorous profession. Nobody writes songs about load-bearing calculations or soil compaction reports. But it is honest work. And for most of my life, I believed that honest work was enough. I retired on the 14th of August. It was a Thursday. My colleague Raymond brought a sheet cake from the Kroger on Washington Street, and everybody stood around the conference table and said nice things about me. My supervisor, a younger man named Phil, who had worked under me for 11 years before eventually working above me, gave a speech that lasted about 4 minutes and made me sound considerably more heroic than I ever was. Someone had ordered a balloon that said "Happy Retirement" in gold letters. It kept drifting into people's faces during the speeches, and everybody pretended not to notice. I drove home that afternoon with a small potted plant someone had given me, a card signed by 32 people, and the strangest feeling I had experienced since the death of my own father. Not grief, exactly. Something quieter than grief and harder to name. The feeling of a door closing behind you that you know will not open again. Maggie had made pot roast for dinner. She had lit candles on the table, which we only do for birthdays and anniversaries, and she was wearing the blue blouse that I have always liked on her. We ate slowly and talked about things we planned to do. A trip to Gatlinburg that we had been putting off for years. Fixing the back porch railing. Maybe finally getting a dog. Something we had been discussing since our youngest left for college 9 years ago. It was a good evening. I remember thinking, sitting there with the candles burning low and Maggie's hand resting on the table near mine, that maybe this was going to be all right. Maybe the second half of things was going to be quieter and softer than the first half. And maybe that was exactly what I needed. That was 83 days ago. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after I retired. I remember because Maggie had gone to her garden club meeting, and I was alone in the house, doing absolutely nothing, which was still something I was getting used to. I had made a second cup of coffee that I did not really need, and was standing at the kitchen window watching a squirrel investigate our bird feeder with the kind of focus and determination that I had once admired in the best engineers I ever worked with. The mail carrier knocked instead of just leaving it in the box. That should have told me something. People only knock when they are delivering something that requires a signature. And things that require a signature are rarely good news. I signed for it. I brought it inside. I set it on this same table where I am sitting now and looked at it for a moment before opening it. The way you look at something when some part of you already knows. Gerald Mast versus Arthur Calloway. I read the name twice. Then I read the whole document, slowly, standing at the table with my coffee going cold beside me. Breach of contract, fraudulent misrepresentation, financial damages in the amount of $240,000. $240,000. I set the papers down. I walked to the window. The squirrel was gone. The bird feeder was swinging slightly in the October wind, empty, and the backyard looked the way backyards in Indiana look in late October, tired and stripped down, like something that has been through a long season and is not entirely sure it will come back in the spring. I stood there for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called my son. Daniel answered on the third ring, which meant he was at his desk and not in a meeting. I knew his schedule the way fathers know these things, not because he told me, but because I had been paying attention for 40 years. I told him what had happened. I kept my voice even. I read him the key parts of the document. I waited. There was a silence on the other end that lasted just a beat too long enough for me to notice it. Long enough for something cold to move through my chest. He said he was sorry to hear that. He said it sounded serious. He asked if I had talked to a lawyer yet, and I said no. I had called him first. There was another silence after that, shorter but somehow heavier. And then he said he would look into some things and call me back. He called back 2 days later. He had spoken to someone at his firm, a colleague with some legal background. Not a real consultation, just an informal conversation. He used the phrase reputational exposure twice. He explained that given his position at the company, given the financial sector, given the current climate, it might be better if he kept some distance from the situation until things were clearer. I listened to all of it. I let him finish. Then I said, "All right, Daniel." And I hung up. I sat in the kitchen for a while after that. Maggie was in the other room. I did not tell her about the call right away. I needed a few minutes to put things back in order inside myself before I could speak normally. That was the moment. I think when I understood what the next few months were going to look like. Not the lawsuit, not Gerald Mast, not the money. Those things were problems, serious ones. But they were the kind of problems that have edges, a beginning, a middle, an end. What Daniel had just told me had no edges. It was just open space in every direction. The kind of thing a father is never entirely prepared for, no matter how old he gets. The other calls came over the following week. My daughter Karen, who lives in Cincinnati with her husband and their 2 kids, called and cried a little and said she wished she could do more. But things were complicated right now. My younger son, Thomas, sent a text message. A text message. It said he was thinking of me and to keep him posted. He used a period at the end, which told me he had reread it at least once before sending, which somehow made it worse. I am not going to spend too much time on this part of the story. It hurts in a way that does not get smaller the more you examine it. So I have learned not to examine it too much. What I will say is this: my children are not bad people. I do not believe that. I raised them and I know them, and I do not believe they are bad people. But they are people who, when the ground shifted, stepped back instead of forward. And that is something a man has to make peace with. Even when the peace is uncomfortable and incomplete and has to be rebuilt a little bit every morning. Maggie never stepped back. Not once. She found out about the lawsuit the same evening I received the letter I told her at dinner. Not because I had decided to tell her, but because I could not sit across from her and pretend. That was always the thing about Maggie. She could read me the way she used to read her students, calmly and completely, and there was never any point in trying to compose myself before she saw through it. She listened to everything. She asked a few questions, practical ones, the kind of questions that told me she was already thinking ahead. Then she got up, cleared the plates, and said, "Well, we will figure it out. Not we will try. Not we will see. We will figure it out." The quiet certainty of it was so absolute that I almost believed her before I had any reason to. The following Monday morning, I called 3 law firms in Indianapolis. The first one quoted me a retainer of $15,000. The second one was slightly less, but not enough to matter. The third one was a younger firm, 2 attorneys who had started their practice 3 years prior, and they were honest enough to tell me that my case had some complexity to it, and they could not guarantee a favorable outcome, which I respected. But their fees were still beyond what I was comfortable committing to, given everything else at stake. I sat with that for a few days. I thought about it the way I used to think about engineering problems, not in a state of panic, but systematically. What do I have? What do I need? What is the distance between those two things, and how do I close it? What I had was a box of 15-year-old documents and 41 years of professional experience that had nothing whatsoever to do with law. What I needed was either a very good lawyer or a very thorough education in a very short amount of time. I decided on the second option, not because it was the better option, because it was the only one I could actually afford. The Indianapolis Public Library on St. Clair Street became the second home I never expected to have at 65. I went there for the first time on a Wednesday afternoon in early November, feeling more out of place than I had felt since my first day as an apprentice engineer 41 years earlier. I asked the reference librarian, a young woman named Claire, who had the kind of patient efficiency that reminded me of the best draftsman I ever worked with, where I might find resources on civil litigation and contract law in Indiana. She did not blink. She walked me to the right section, pulled 3 books, and pointed me toward a computer terminal where I could access legal databases. Then she said, quietly, that if I needed help finding anything specific, I should just ask. I thanked her. I sat down. I opened the first book, and somewhere in that quiet library on a gray November afternoon, with the sound of rain beginning against the tall windows and the smell of old books around me, something in me settled into place. Not confidence, not yet, but something close to it. The feeling of a man who has decided, finally and completely, which direction he is walking in. I want to tell you something about Gerald Mast, because I think you need to understand who he is before the rest of this story makes the kind of sense it should. I met Gerald in the spring of what must have been 15 years ago, when I was still a senior project engineer at Hartwell and Associates, and he was a private contractor who had won a bid on a mixed-use development project on the east side of Indianapolis. The project was called Meridian Commons, which was a grand name for what was essentially a strip of retail space with apartments above it. The kind of building that Indianapolis had been putting up along its corridors for years. Gerald was not a bad contractor. I want to be fair about that. He ran a tight operation, his crews were competent, and in the early months of the project he was exactly the kind of partner you hoped for on a job that size. He was also, even then, a man who kept very careful track of what he believed he was owed. The trouble started in the second year. There were soil issues on the eastern foundation that required a redesign of the load distribution my call, made correctly, documented thoroughly. The redesign added 6 weeks to the schedule and increased Gerald's costs by something in the range of $40,000. He absorbed it without much complaint at the time. But I noticed the way he wrote it down in his notebook. Slowly. Like a man filing something away. We finished the project. The building still stands on East Washington Street. I drove past it a few years ago, and it looked fine. Which is all you can ask of a building, that it stands. That it does what it was built to do. That nothing falls on anybody. Gerald and I parted professionally, but not warmly. There were some final invoicing disagreements that were resolved through the company's standard process. Nothing unusual. Nothing that rose to the level of a legal dispute. Or so I thought. What I did not know, what I would not know until I started going through that cardboard box on my kitchen table, was that Gerald Mast had never entirely let it go. He had kept his own copies of everything. He had his own version of the story, one in which the soil redesign had been not a necessary engineering correction, but a deliberate decision that had cost him money for reasons that served someone other than the project. His version required a certain amount of creative interpretation of the facts. But Gerald was apparently a patient man, and patient men with creative interpretations of the facts can cause a great deal of trouble if they choose the right moment. He chose the right moment. I do not know exactly when Gerald began putting his case together. What I do know, what that box eventually told me, is that someone had given him information. Not public information, specific information. The date of my retirement, the status of my employment, the fact that I would no longer have the resources of a company legal department behind me. That information did not come from a newspaper. It did not come from a public announcement. It came from someone who knew me. Someone close enough to know the details and careless enough or willing enough to pass them along. I did not know that yet on the night I first opened the box. That night I was simply a man sitting at his kitchen table at 11 o'clock, reading 15-year-old documents by the light above the stove, trying to understand what had been done to him and why. Maggie came downstairs. At some point, I am not sure what time it was. She looked at the papers spread across the table, looked at me, and did not say anything about the hour or the mess. She made 2 cups of tea, set one in front of me, and sat down across the table with her own. We sat like that for a while, the two of us, with the papers between us and the house quiet around us and the Indiana night pressing cold against the kitchen windows. She asked me what I had found so far. I told her not everything, because I had not found everything yet, but what I had. She listened the way she always listened, with her whole attention, without interrupting, in the particular way that had always made me feel that what I was saying mattered. Then she said, "We are going to need to organize all of this properly." She said it the way she used to talk about reorganizing the linen closet or planting the garden for spring, as if the scale of a thing was not a reason to feel overwhelmed by it, only a reason to be systematic. I looked at her across the table, 62 years old, no makeup, hair not quite right from sleep, wearing the old green cardigan she had owned since before our youngest was born. And I thought, not for the first time, but with a particular clarity that you sometimes get late at night when everything else has been stripped away, that I had married someone extraordinary and had not always had the wisdom to fully understand it while I was busy building other things. I said, "I don't know how this is going to go." "Maggie," she said, "I know you don't. Neither do I. But I know you. And that's enough for me." I looked back down at the papers. The October wind moved outside. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and then went quiet. And I put my hand on the first folder and kept reading. I made a decision that night, sitting at that kitchen table with Maggie's tea going cold beside me and 15 years of paperwork spread out under the light. I was going to handle this myself. Not because I was confident, not because I had any particular knowledge of civil litigation or Indiana contract law or the procedural requirements of Marion County Circuit Court. I had none of those things. What I had was 41 years of solving problems that other people said could not be solved. A cardboard box full of documentation, and the stubborn conviction, the kind that lives somewhere below rational thought. In the part of a man that does not negotiate that I had done nothing wrong, and that the truth was in that box if I was willing to dig for it. I had called 3 law firms. The numbers they quoted me were not impossible in the abstract, but they were impossible in the specific, given where Maggie and I stood financially. We were not poor people. We had savings, a modest retirement account, the equity in the house we had lived in for 31 years, but $240,000 in claimed damages, plus legal fees on top of that, meant that every dollar I spent defending myself was a dollar that could not absorb a judgment if things went wrong. I needed to be careful. I needed to be precise. I needed, in other words, to think like an engineer. An engineer does not panic when a problem is large. An engineer looks at the problem, identifies its components, determines which components he can address and which ones he cannot, and begins with what he can address. The rest follows from there, or it does not. And you deal with what comes. The first component was documentation. I needed to understand exactly what Gerald Mast was claiming and exactly what evidence I had to counter it. That meant going through every single piece of paper in that box, which I began that night and continued for the better part of 3 days. What I found. When I laid it all out on the kitchen table with Maggie's help, she had a teacher's instinct for organization that was considerably better than mine, was something that actually steadied me. The record was good. My record. The engineering decisions were documented. The soil assessment was documented. The redesign was documented with the reasoning intact. Every significant decision had a paper trail, because that was how I had always worked. Not because I anticipated needing to defend myself one day, but because that was what good engineering practice required. Gerald's case, as far as I could interpret it from the legal complaint, rested on 2 claims. The first was that the soil redesign had been unnecessary and had been ordered to benefit Hartwell and Associates at the expense of his contracting budget. The second was that I had misrepresented the timeline and cost implications of the redesign to the project owners, causing him to absorb costs that should have been shared or reimbursed. Both claims required him to prove intent, not just error intent, that I had knowingly made a decision that was wrong or knowingly misrepresented information. That was a high bar. And the documentation in my box suggested it was a bar he was going to have difficulty clearing. But I was not a lawyer. I knew how to read a structural report. I did not know how to read a legal argument. And so the library became my second education. I want to say something about those weeks at the Indianapolis Public Library, because they were among the strangest and most unexpectedly valuable weeks of my life. I am a man who spent 4 decades in a professional environment, offices, job sites, conference rooms. I had not been a student in any real sense since I finished my engineering degree in 1982. Sitting at a library table with a stack of legal textbooks, taking notes in a yellow legal pad like a man preparing for an exam he was not sure he could pass, was humbling in a way that I had not anticipated. The other people at the library did not care who I was or what I was there for. There was a young man who came in every Tuesday and Thursday and worked on what appeared to be a novel, typing steadily for hours without looking up. There was an older woman, perhaps 70 or so, who read large print mysteries with great concentration and occasionally fell asleep in her chair in a way that I found oddly comforting. There was a group of high school students who came in after 3 o'clock and were considerably less studious than the setting suggested they should be, but who were harmless enough. Claire, the reference librarian, learned my name by the second week. She never asked me what I was preparing for. She simply pointed me toward what I needed when I needed it. And once, when I was struggling to understand a particular aspect of the discovery process in Indiana civil procedure, she suggested a specific resource with the quiet efficiency of someone who had helped people through difficult things before and knew better than to make a fuss about it. I am grateful to that woman. I do not think she knows how grateful. By the end of those 3 weeks, I understood enough to know what I was dealing with. Not everything. A man cannot become a lawyer in 3 weeks, and I want to be honest about that. But I understood the structure of the proceeding, the standards of evidence, and most importantly, I understood the weaknesses in Gerald's case well enough to know where to push. What I did not yet understand, what the box had not yet fully told me, was the question that had begun to form in the back of my mind, like a splinter working its way to the surface. Gerald Mast had waited 15 years. 15 years since the end of that project. 15 years of silence. And then a certified letter arriving 6 weeks after my retirement. The timing was not an accident. It could not be. A lawsuit of this complexity does not get filed in 6 weeks. It gets prepared. It gets researched. It gets built, piece by someone who knew in advance that a particular moment was coming. Someone had told him. Someone who knew me, knew my plans, knew the date I was walking out of Hartwell and Associates for the last time. I sat with that question for a long time before I was ready to look for the answer. Because the answer, I was beginning to suspect, was not going to come from a stranger. The box still had things to tell me. I just had not asked it the right questions yet. Outside, Indianapolis moved through its November rhythms, the cold settling in properly now. The sky that particular shade of flat gray that Indiana does better than anywhere else. The trees along our street bare and patient, waiting for whatever came next. I knew how they felt. Daniel came to Indianapolis on a Saturday in early November. He drove down from Chicago, which is about 3 hours depending on traffic on the 94, and he arrived just after noon in the silver sedan he had bought 2 years ago that still looked new because Daniel was the kind of man who kept his possessions in perfect condition. He pulled into our driveway and sat in the car for a moment before getting out, which I saw from the kitchen window and did not mention. Maggie had made lunch. She always makes lunch when someone comes, regardless of the circumstances, because that is who she is, the kind of woman who believes that a meal on the table is a form of dignity, a way of saying that whatever is happening, we are still people who sit down together and eat. She had made chicken soup and cornbread, Daniel's favorites from when he was a boy. And I noticed that and did not mention that either. He looked good. He always looks good. Daniel is 40 years old and carries himself the way men do when they have spent their adult lives in professional environments that reward appearance upright, composed, the kind of man who irons his casual clothes. He hugged Maggie first, then me. And the hug he gave me was the kind that lasts exactly the right amount of time. Not too short to seem cold, not long enough to seem like an apology. We ate lunch. We talked about the drive, about Chicago, about his wife Renee and their daughter Sophie, who had just turned 7. Maggie asked about Sophie's school, and Daniel's face softened the way it only ever does when he talks about his daughter. And for a little while the kitchen felt almost normal. Then Maggie excused herself to the garden, which was her way of giving us the room. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at me. He said he had been thinking about the situation a great deal. He said he wanted me to know that he took it seriously and that he understood how stressful it must be. He said Renee was concerned and sent her love. He said he had done some more research and had a few thoughts. I told him to go ahead. What followed was about 20 minutes of careful, well-organized, completely reasonable explanation for why Daniel Calloway could not be visibly involved in his father's legal situation. He talked about his firm's conflict of interest policies. He talked about the financial sector's sensitivity to litigation associations. He talked about the potential impact on his own career trajectory at a time when he was being considered for a senior position. He talked about Renee's anxiety and Sophie's school costs and the mortgage on the house in Evanston. Every single thing he said was true. I do not doubt that. And every single thing he said was also, underneath the reasonable language and the genuine concern, a way of telling me that when the moment came, he had looked at the scale of things and put himself first. I listened to all of it without interrupting. I have sat through enough presentations in my professional life to know that interrupting a man in the middle of his prepared remarks rarely produces anything useful. You let him finish, you let him hear himself, and then you respond to what he actually said, rather than what he was trying to say. When he finished, I asked him one question. I asked him if the situation were reversed, if it were him sitting at this table with a $240,000 lawsuit and no lawyer and a retirement account that could be gone by spring. What would he want his father to do? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, it's not that simple." I said, "I know it isn't. I just wanted you to sit with the question for a minute." He left around 4 o'clock. He hugged Maggie for a long time at the door and told her to call him if she needed anything. He shook my hand, which felt strange, the way it feels strange when formality appears in a place where it does not belong. He got in his silver car and backed out of the driveway and drove north toward the highway. Maggie came and stood beside me at the window. We watched the car until it turned at the end of the street. She did not say anything. Neither did I. There are moments in a marriage when words are simply not the right tool, and this was one of them. She put her hand through my arm, and we stood there together until the street was empty again. And then we went back inside and I washed the lunch dishes while she put away the cornbread, and neither of us spoke for a good long while. That evening I wrote Daniel's name on a piece of paper and set it aside. Not in anger. Just as a fact to be acknowledged and then placed somewhere where it would not interfere with what needed to be done. The other children had already made their positions clear without the courtesy of a visit. Karen's phone call had been warm and tearful and entirely useless. Thomas's text message remained the single most dispiriting communication I had received in 65 years of living. And I have received some dispiriting communications in my time. I was on my own, or rather I was with Maggie, which is a different thing entirely, and in many ways a better thing, though it took me some years and some difficulty to fully understand why. The financial picture clarified itself over the following weeks, in the way that unpleasant things tend to clarify slowly at first, and then all at once. Our retirement savings were not in immediate danger of being seized, but they were in the shadow of the lawsuit in a way that changed how we could use them. The claimed damages of $240,000 represented something close to a third of what Maggie and I had saved over 4 decades of careful living, not extravagant savings, but honest ones. The kind built from a life that did not waste much and did not expect much beyond what it earned. I had already begun to understand that even a successful defense was going to cost us filing fees, document reproduction, the various procedural costs of representing myself in Marion County Circuit Court, which were not enormous individually, but accumulated with the reliable persistence of water finding its way through stone. We sat down one evening with our account statements and a yellow legal pad and went through everything the way we used to go through the household budget when the children were young and money was tighter, methodically, without drama, identifying what was necessary and what was not. The trip to Gatlinburg went first. That was easy. The dog we had been talking about went next, which was harder for Maggie than she showed. We cut the streaming services down to 1. We stopped eating out, which had never been a major expense but was one of the small pleasures that retirement was supposed to provide. Maggie started buying the store brand of things she had been buying by name for 30 years. The quiet efficiency of it so matter-of-fact that it broke my heart a little every time I saw the different labels in the pantry. I did not tell her that. She did not need to hear it. What I did not know during those weeks of careful accounting was that Maggie was doing her own accounting on the side, in a way she had not mentioned to me. I found out on a Tuesday afternoon in late November. I had come home from the library with a yellow legal pad full of notes on Indiana rules of trial procedure, and was coming through the kitchen when I noticed that the shelf above the fireplace in the living room looked different. It took me a moment to understand why. The pair of silver candlesticks that had belonged to Maggie's mother were gone. I stood in the doorway of the living room for a long moment. Those candlesticks had been on that shelf for the entire 31 years we had lived in this house. They had been at every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday dinner. Maggie's mother had brought them from her own mother's house. And when Maggie's mother passed, they had come to us. And Maggie had placed them on that shelf, and they had stayed there. I went to the kitchen. Maggie was making dinner, her back to me. I asked her about the candlesticks. She was quiet for a moment, still facing the stove. Then she said she had sold them, along with a few other pieces of jewelry she did not wear anymore, at an estate sale shop on Broad Ripple Avenue. She said she had gotten a fair price. She said the money was in the household account. I stood there not knowing what to say, which is not a condition I find myself in very often. She turned around then and looked at me with an expression that was calm and direct and entirely characteristic of the woman I had been married to for 38 years. She said, before I could speak, that she did not want to discuss whether she should have done it. She said she had thought about it and decided, and that was the end of it. She said the only thing she wanted to know was whether the soup she was making was going to be enough for dinner, or whether I wanted her to make something else as well. I said the soup was fine. I went and sat down at the kitchen table. I looked at the space on the shelf where the candlesticks had been, visible from where I sat through the doorway. I thought about Maggie standing in that estate sale shop on Broad Ripple Avenue, handing over her mother's candlesticks to a stranger across a counter. And I felt something move through me that was too large and too complicated to have a simple name. What I felt, I think, was the specific weight of being loved by someone who does not make a performance of loving you. No announcement, no martyrdom, no request for acknowledgement. She had simply looked at the situation, identified what she could do, and done it. The way she had been doing things, quietly and completely. For 38 years, I was not going to let that be for nothing. The first preliminary hearing was scheduled for the second week of December, which gave me approximately 6 weeks from the time I received the summons to prepare something resembling a coherent legal defense. I want to be honest about those 6 weeks, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story worth telling. There were days when I sat at the library table and read the same paragraph 4 times without retaining it, and stared out the window at the gray Indianapolis sky and felt something very close to despair. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that settles in around the edges of things when you are tired and uncertain, and the problem in front of you is larger than anything in your previous experience. I am an engineer. I understand systems. I understand how forces act on structures and how to calculate the point at which a material will fail. What I did not understand was the law, and the law is not a system in the engineering sense. It is more like a language, one that has its own grammar and its own idioms and its own way of saying things that mean something quite different from what they appear to mean on the surface. Learning it at 65, alone, in 6 weeks, with stakes that included my financial security and my reputation, was the hardest thing I had done since I could remember. But I did it, or I did enough of it. By the time the first hearing arrived, I had prepared a written response to Gerald's complaint that I was reasonably confident was procedurally correct. I had identified the key documents in my box that supported my position. I had written out, in plain language, the engineering rationale for every decision Gerald was challenging, and I had practiced standing up in my living room, in front of Maggie, and saying what I needed to say without my voice going somewhere it should not go. Maggie sat in the armchair and listened to me practice 3 times. She did not offer excessive encouragement. She asked questions the way a sharp student asks questions, not to undermine, but to find the places where the argument had gaps. When I stumbled over a technical explanation, she said, "Say it the way you would explain it to someone who has never been on a construction site." When I got too formal, she said, "You sound like you are reading a contract. Just talk." She was, in those sessions, the best preparation I could have had. The Marion County Circuit Court building on Delaware Street is an old building with high ceilings and marble floors that make every footstep sound louder than it should. I arrived 40 minutes early on the morning of the first hearing, which was my habit in any situation that mattered. Arriving early is the only form of punctuality that actually prepares you for what is coming, rather than simply getting you there on time. Gerald Mast was already in the hallway when I arrived. I had not seen him in 15 years. He had aged, as everyone does, but he was still a large man, broad across the shoulders, with the particular physical confidence of someone who has spent his life doing physical work and has not lost the body that work builds. He was with his attorney, a younger man in a gray suit who was looking at his phone. Gerald looked up when I walked in. Our eyes met for a moment. He nodded. I nodded. That was the entirety of what passed between us, and it told me everything I needed to know about what kind of man he had decided to be in this situation. The hearing itself lasted about 45 minutes. It was procedural, the judge, a woman named Hartley who had the calm efficiency of someone who had seen every variation of human dispute and was not surprised by any of them, reviewed the filings, established the timeline, and set the date for the full trial. She asked me, directly and without condescension, whether I understood my rights as a self-represented litigant. I said that I did. She looked at me for a moment in the way that judges look at people when they are deciding something about them. And then she moved on. Gerald's attorney made a brief argument that the court should consider a summary motion based on the strength of his client's documentation. Judge Hartley denied it without much deliberation and set the discovery deadline for late January. I walked out of that courthouse into the December air and stood on the steps for a moment. The cold hit me the way Indiana cold does in December, direct and honest, no pretense about it. I had survived the first hearing. I had stood in a courtroom and represented myself, and the ceiling had not fallen in. I called Maggie from the parking lot. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting. I told her it went all right. She said, "I know it did." I said, "You couldn't have known that." She said, "I told you. I know you." That's enough. I drove home through the December streets of Indianapolis, the holiday decorations going up along Meridian Street, the city moving around me in its ordinary way, indifferent to the fact that something had shifted, however slightly, in the direction of a man driving north in a 14-year-old Ford who had just spoken his own name aloud in a court of law and was still standing. It was sometime in the second week of December, after the first hearing and before Christmas, that the question I had been carrying began to press harder against the inside of my thinking. Who had told Gerald Mast? I had been setting it aside, filing it under things to address later, because the immediate demands of preparation had left little room for anything else. But the hearing was done, and the next deadline was 6 weeks away, and my mind, freed from the urgency of the immediate, returned to the question the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. I went back to the box. I was looking for something specific this time, not the broad survey I had done in those first days, but something targeted. I was looking for any document, any email, any piece of paper that suggested Gerald Mast had knowledge he should not have had, knowledge that could only have come from someone inside my life. The retirement date itself was not a secret. It had been announced at Hartwell and Associates several months before I actually left. The standard procedure for a senior employee transitioning out. But the specific financial implications, the fact that I no longer had company legal support, the status of my retirement account, the vulnerability of my position that was not public information, that was the kind of information that requires either direct access or a particular kind of conversation with someone who has it. I found what I was looking for on a Tuesday evening in mid-December, in a folder near the bottom of the box that I had gone through quickly in my initial survey and not examined carefully enough. It was a printed email, mine, from the Hartwell and Associates system, dated about 4 months before my retirement. I had sent it to the company's HR department confirming my retirement date and requesting information about the transition of my benefits and retirement account. Standard procedure. The kind of email a man sends without thinking twice about it because it is a routine administrative matter. The email had been forwarded. Not by me. Someone had accessed it or had it described to them in enough detail, and the information had moved. I could not prove the chain of transmission from a printed email alone, but I could see the outline of it the way you can see the outline of a structure before the walls go up. The skeleton of a thing that tells you what the finished shape will be. I sat with that piece of paper for a long time. The circle of people who had access to that kind of information was not large. Colleagues at Hartwell, HR staff, and family, the kind of casual conversation where a son mentions to an acquaintance that his father is retiring in August, that he will be on his own after that, that the timing is what it is, not malicious, not deliberate. The ordinary, careless flow of information between people who do not realize that somewhere downstream, someone is listening. I did not reach a conclusion that night. Not a certain one, but the shape of it was there. And I knew that when the time came when I had enough to say something that was true rather than merely suspected, I would have to decide what to do with it. That was perhaps the hardest part of all of it. Not the law, not the money. Not even the loneliness of standing in a courtroom without anyone from my family in the seats behind me. The hardest part was the possibility, not yet a certainty, but a real and growing possibility that the person who had set all of this in motion, however inadvertently, was someone I had raised. I closed the box that night and did not open it again until after Christmas. We had a quiet Christmas, Maggie and I. The children sent gifts and called on Christmas morning, and the conversations were warm enough on the surface, the way water can look calm even when something is moving underneath it. We did not have the family gathering we usually had. Karen said the drive was too much with the kids. Thomas said he and his girlfriend had made other plans. Daniel sent a gift card and a card signed by both him and Renee in handwriting that told me neither of them had written it first. Maggie made a small ham, and we ate at the kitchen table with the good dishes and the electric candles she had put up in place of the silver candlesticks. And the meal was good, and the house was warm, and I was aware, in a way that I had not been in previous years, of how much of what made Christmas feel like Christmas had always been her doing. After dinner, she sat across from me with her tea and asked how I was feeling. Not about the case, about everything. The way she sometimes asks questions that are bigger than they sound. I told her I was all right. I told her I was tired in a way that sleep did not entirely fix. I told her I was grateful, and I meant it as a complete sentence, not the beginning of a longer one. Grateful. Full stop. For the ham and the good dishes and the electric candles and the woman sitting across from me who had sold her mother's candlesticks without making me feel the weight of it for a single moment longer than necessary. She looked at me over her tea with those steady gray eyes of hers and said, "Well, we are going to be all right. Arthur, I don't know exactly how, but we are." I believed her. Not because I had reason to, because she said it. And in 38 years, she had not yet been wrong about the things that mattered. January in Indianapolis is not a gentle month. The cold that settles in after Christmas is a different kind of cold from the cold of November and December. Those earlier months have a certain drama to them, the first hard frosts, the first snow, the holidays moving through with their noise and light. January has none of that. January is just cold, flat and patient and indifferent. The sky the color of old concrete. The bare trees along our street standing in it without complaint because they have no other choice. I understood something about those trees that January. The discovery deadline was the last week of January, which meant I had roughly 4 weeks after Christmas to complete my document production and submit everything to Gerald's attorney. In civil litigation, discovery is the process by which both sides exchange the evidence they intend to rely on at trial. It is, in theory, a process designed to ensure fairness. Both parties see what the other party has, and surprises are minimized. In practice, for a self-represented litigant going up against an experienced attorney, it is a process that requires extraordinary precision, because a mistake in discovery does not just weaken your case, it can end it. I spent those 4 weeks at the kitchen table more than at the library. The library had given me what I needed in terms of general education. Now the work was specific sorting, labeling, organizing, copying, and submitting the contents of that cardboard box in a form that met the procedural requirements of Marion County Circuit Court. Maggie helped me every evening. She sat across the table with a yellow legal pad of her own and kept track of what we had cataloged and what we had not. The way she used to keep track of her students' progress methodically, without fuss, with the particular kind of attention that comes from genuinely caring whether the thing gets done right. There were 114 documents in that box, By the time we finished, every one of them had been numbered, labeled, and cross-referenced against the specific claims in Gerald's complaint. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that makes your eyes hurt after 3 hours and your back ache from sitting in a kitchen chair. The kind of work that a good law firm would have assigned to a paralegal and billed at $150 an hour. We did it at our kitchen table for the cost of a ream of paper and a box of file folders from the Office Depot on East Washington Street. On the last Friday of January, I drove to the courthouse on Delaware Street and submitted my discovery production. The clerk, a young man who had seen me enough times by now to give me a small nod of recognition, accepted the documents, stamped the receipt, and handed me my copy. I folded it and put it in my coat pocket and walked back out into the January cold. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes before starting the engine. Not because I was upset, because I needed a moment to acknowledge what had just happened. The way you sometimes need to stand still for a second after finishing something difficult, before you can move on to what comes next. I had submitted a complete and properly formatted discovery production in a civil lawsuit in which I was representing myself against an opposing counsel who had been practicing law for 20-some years, and I had done it on time and without significant error. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, something that the 65-year-old man standing on that retirement party stage in August with a balloon drifting into his face would not have believed himself capable of. I started the car and drove home through the gray January streets. The trial date was set for the 3rd week of March, 7 weeks away. It was in the first week of February that I found the thing that changed everything. I had been through the box many times by then. I knew its contents the way you come to know a piece of music you have listened to repeatedly, not just the broad movements, but the specific moments, the particular quality of individual passages, the places where something unexpected lives if you are paying attention. But there was one folder I had set aside early in the process and returned to only occasionally, a folder of internal project communications from the Meridian Commons job, emails and memos between myself, the project owners, and various subcontractors. I had reviewed it in my initial survey, found nothing that seemed immediately relevant, and moved on. The discovery process had required me to include it in my production, so I had cataloged it, but I had not read every document in it with the same care I had given the engineering reports and the contract documents. On a Tuesday evening in early February, with 7 weeks until trial and Maggie reading in the living room and the house quiet around me, I sat down and read every single page of that folder from the beginning. The 3rd document from the bottom was a memo, internal, from Gerald Mast's own contracting company, addressed to his project manager at the time. I should not have had it. It had been included in a batch of project documents that Gerald's side had submitted as part of their own discovery production, and in the volume of paper that both sides had exchanged. This particular memo had apparently not been reviewed carefully enough by Gerald's attorney before submission. It was dated 6 months into the Meridian Commons project, roughly a year before the soil issues arose. I read it twice. Then I read it a 3rd time, slowly. The way you read something when you want to be absolutely certain you are understanding it correctly and not seeing what you want to see. What the memo described, in the flat language of an internal business communication, was a calculation, Gerald Mast's own calculation, in his own words, relayed to his project manager, of the financial benefit to his company if the Eastern Foundation work could be delayed by 6 to 8 weeks and the associated costs attributed to engineering decisions rather than contractor scheduling. He had identified, in advance, the soil conditions on the eastern side of the site as a potential point of dispute. He had noted that a redesign, if ordered, could be framed as unnecessary and used as the basis for a future claim against the engineering firm. He had been planning this, not for 15 years, for longer than that. He had seen the opportunity in the soil report before I had even made my recommendation, and he had positioned himself to exploit it. The redesign I had ordered was not the cause of his grievance. It was the trigger he had been waiting for. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time without moving. Outside, February pressed its cold face against the kitchen windows. The street was empty and dark. Somewhere in the living room I could hear the faint sound of Maggie turning a page. What I was holding was not just a document. It was the answer to a question I had been carrying for months. Not the question of who had told Gerald about my retirement. That question was still only partially resolved, but the deeper question, the one that had sat underneath everything else like a foundation problem waiting to be discovered. The question of whether any of this had ever been about justice, about a genuine grievance, about a man who truly believed he had been wronged. It had not been. It had never been. Gerald Mast had engineered this situation the way a man engineers a trap, patiently, methodically, with an eye on a future he was willing to wait for. I got up and went to the doorway of the living room. Maggie looked up from her book. I said, "I need you to come read something." She came. She sat down across from me and read the memo twice, the way I had, carefully and without speaking. Then she looked up at me. She said, "This changes things." I said, "Yes, it does." She said, "How much?" I said I did not know exactly, but I knew it was significant. I knew it was the kind of document that a judge needed to see. And I knew that whatever happened next, I was no longer walking into that courtroom carrying only my own word against Gerald Mast's. I was walking in with his. The weeks between finding the memo and the trial were the strangest weeks of the whole ordeal, in a way that I find difficult to describe precisely. The discovery of that document did not make me feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that, because I think people might expect it to the moment when the evidence turns, when the case shifts, when the man who has been fighting alone suddenly finds the weapon he needed. In the movies, that moment comes with swelling music and a change in the light. In real life, it comes at a kitchen table at 9:30 on a Tuesday evening in February. And what you feel is not triumph, but something quieter and more complicated. A kind of exhausted clarity. The feeling of a man who has been walking through fog for a long time and has just caught a glimpse of solid ground, not reached it yet, but seen it. I spent the following 2 weeks doing what needed to be done with the memo. I consulted the Indiana rules of evidence to understand how it could be introduced at trial as an admission by a party opponent. I prepared a supplemental disclosure for the court. I drafted the section of my closing argument that would address it directly. I did all of this carefully and methodically, the way I had done everything in this process, because the document was only valuable if I knew how to use it correctly. But in the quieter hours, the evenings when the preparation was done for the day and the house was still, I found myself thinking less about the case and more about everything surrounding it. I thought about Daniel. I had been carrying the question of Daniel's role in all of this since December, when I had first seen the outline of how Gerald's information might have traveled. In the weeks since then, I had not been able to add certainty to what was still only a strong suspicion. There was no document that named Daniel. There was no direct evidence of a conversation. What I had was logic and circumstance, and the particular knowledge of a father who understood how his son moved through the world, the social networks, the professional connections. The way Daniel had always talked about family matters a little too freely in contexts that seemed safe, but were not always as closed as he assumed. I could not prove it, and I was not sure, if I could prove it, what I would do with the proof. That was the question I sat with in those February evenings. Not the legal question, the human one. If Daniel had inadvertently provided the information that Gerald used to time his attack, what did that mean for us, for the case? For us. For the particular kind of relationship a father has with a son who has already shown, in the most important moment so far, that he would step back when stepping forward was required. I did not discuss this with Maggie in any direct way. She knew I was thinking about it. She always knew what I was thinking about. More or less, but she did not push. She had a gift for understanding when a thing needed to be worked out privately before it could be spoken. And she gave me the space for that, without making the space feel like distance. One evening in late February, she came into the kitchen while I was sitting with my legal pad, and she put a cup of coffee in front of me without being asked, and then sat down across from me and said, "You are going to need to let some of this go before you walk into that courtroom." I asked her what she meant. She said, "Not the preparation. The preparation is fine. I mean the rest of it. Daniel, the children. Whatever it is you have been turning over in your head for the past 3 weeks. You cannot carry all of that in there with you." I said I was not sure I could set it down that easily. She said, "I am not asking you to resolve it. I am asking you to set it down temporarily. Put it somewhere outside yourself for long enough to do what you need to do in that room. You can pick it back up afterward. It will still be there." I looked at her. She was right, as she generally was about the things that mattered, and the particular way she said it not as instruction, not as pressure, but as the simple observation of a woman who had been watching me closely for 38 years and knew exactly where the load was sitting, made it possible to actually do it. I said, "All right." She nodded and picked up her coffee, and we sat together for a while in the kitchen with the February dark outside the windows. And I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for a long time. The second hearing came in late February, about 3 weeks before the trial. It was a pre-trial conference, a procedural session in which both sides present their final positions, identify witnesses and exhibits, and address any outstanding motions before the trial itself begins. Judge Hartley presided with the same unhurried efficiency she had brought to the first hearing. The quality of a person who has long since stopped being impressed by the theater of legal proceedings and is interested only in the substance. Gerald's attorney, whose name I had by now learned was a man called Briggs, had filed a motion in limine in the days before the conference, a request to exclude certain documents from the trial on the grounds that they had not been properly authenticated. It was a tactical move, and a reasonably good one. The documents he was targeting were among the strongest pieces of my documentary evidence, including the original soil assessment report and several of the engineering memos that most directly contradicted Gerald's version of events. I had anticipated something like this. Not that specific motion, but the general shape of it, the attempt, in the final weeks before trial, to narrow the evidentiary field in ways that favored the side with the more experienced legal representation. I had prepared a response when Judge Hartley invited me to address the motion. I stood up at the table. I had learned by now the rhythm of standing and sitting in that room, the physical grammar of it, and I walked through the authentication argument methodically. I cited the relevant Indiana rule. I identified the specific chain of custody for each challenged document. I explained why each document met the standard for admission. It took me about 12 minutes. I had practiced it 4 times, twice alone and twice in front of Maggie. When I finished, Judge Hartley asked Briggs 2 questions about his authentication objections that suggested she had found them less persuasive than he had hoped. Then she denied the motion and confirmed the trial date. I sat back down. My hands were steady. I noted that with a kind of detached interest, the way you might note an unexpected result in a technical measurement, not what you necessarily predicted, but worth recording accurately. Briggs did not look at me as we gathered our papers after the conference. Gerald, sitting beside him, looked at me once as he stood to leave. His expression was not what I expected. I had anticipated something harder: anger or contempt, or the particular blankness of a man who is committed to a course of action and is not going to deviate from it regardless of what happens. What I saw instead was something that looked, briefly, like uncertainty. Good. I drove home through the late February streets, the first hints of something warmer beginning to move at the edges of the Indiana air. The kind of almost warmth that February offers sometimes as a suggestion rather than a promise. I called Maggie from the car. She answered on the first ring. I told her the motion had been denied. She said, "Of course it was." I said, "You are remarkably confident for someone who was not in the room." She said, "I told you already. Arthur, I know you." I laughed. It was a real laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere genuine rather than from the effort of maintaining composure. And I realized it was the first real laugh I had produced in several months. It surprised me. It surprised me enough that I sat with it for a moment after it passed. The way you sit with something unexpected and pleasant, noting its texture, grateful for it. 3 weeks until trial. The week before the trial, Maggie got sick. Not seriously, I want to say that clearly, because the fear of those first 2 days was significant enough that I need to address it directly. It was not serious in the end, but for 48 hours, from the Sunday before the trial through the Monday evening when the fever broke and she started to come back to herself, I sat with a fear that had nothing to do with Gerald Mast or Marion County Circuit Court or $240,000. She had been tired for weeks. I had noticed it and said nothing. Partly because she would have dismissed my concern and partly because I had been absorbed enough in my own preparation that noticing without addressing is easier than it should be. The tiredness had been the kind that accumulates in a person who has been carrying more than their share of something for a long time. The kind that does not come from physical exertion, but from the sustained effort of being strong for someone else without relief. The fever came on Sunday morning. By Sunday afternoon, it was high enough that I called the doctor's after-hours line, and the nurse told me to monitor it and bring her in Monday morning if it had not broken. I spent Sunday night in the armchair in our bedroom, not sleeping, watching her sleep, listening to her breathe. There is a particular quality of fear that comes to a man in his 60s when the person who has been beside him for 38 years is lying still in a way that is not entirely like her ordinary stillness. It is not a rational fear. Necessarily, a fever is a fever. People recover from fevers. There was no reason to believe this was anything more than what the nurse said it was. But it is a fear that goes underneath rationality, that touches something older and more fundamental. The fear of a life rearranged in a way you did not choose and cannot engineer your way out of. I sat in that armchair, and I thought about what the past several months had actually cost her. Not the candlesticks, not the store-brand groceries, not the trip to Gatlinburg or the dog we had not gotten. I thought about the weight she had been carrying quietly, without complaint, without acknowledgement, the weight of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the first days of this crisis, that her job was to make sure I did not fall, and who had done that job every single day since then without once asking whether anyone was doing the same for her. I had been grateful. I had told her I was grateful, which was true, but gratitude and attention are not the same thing, and I had been paying more attention to my legal pad than to the woman across the table from me. The fever broke Monday evening. She sat up in bed and asked for water, and then asked how the trial preparation was going, which was so entirely characteristic of her that I had to look away for a moment before I could answer. I told her the preparation was fine. I told her I needed her to rest and not think about any of it until she was better. She said she was already better. I said, "Maggie." She looked at me. Something in my voice must have told her this was not the moment to argue, because she lay back down and closed her eyes and said, "All right, Arthur, I'll rest." I sat beside the bed for a long time after she fell asleep. The house was quiet. The March night was cold outside the window, but less cold than it had been. The temperature had been climbing by degrees for the past week. The way Indiana eases into spring, reluctantly and then all at once. I thought about what I was walking into in 6 days. Not the legal arguments, not the documents, not the procedure. I thought about what it meant to stand up in a room full of strangers and speak the truth about your own life. To ask people you have never met to believe you on the basis of nothing more than your word and your evidence, and the particular quality of a man who has nothing left to hide. I thought about Gerald Mast and the memo in that folder, and the 15 years of patience it had taken him to build a trap around someone else's honest work. I thought about the soil on the east side of a building on East Washington Street that had required a redesign in the second year of a project. A decision I had made correctly and documented thoroughly and stood behind completely. A decision that a man had decided to weaponize because he was the kind of man who kept track of what he believed he was owed and waited for the moment when the accounting would be most advantageous. And I thought about my children. Not with anger, I had set the anger down, the way Maggie had asked me to, with something more like sorrow, the clean kind, the kind that has been examined enough to lose its jagged edges. They were my children, and I loved them, and they had failed me. And both of those things were true at the same time, and always would be. And there was no resolution to that except to carry it honestly and not let it harden into something worse. I finished the final draft of my closing argument on the Wednesday before the trial. I read it aloud in the kitchen, alone, at 7 in the morning, with Maggie still sleeping upstairs and the early March light coming through the window above the sink. I read it the way she had taught me to read it, not like a contract, not like a report, like a man talking. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet around me. The coffee was getting cold. Outside, a pair of birds had arrived in the bare tree at the edge of the yard. The first ones I had seen since fall, and they were doing what birds do in early March in Indiana, sitting in the cold light. Not yet singing, but present, waiting for the season to catch up with their arrival. I thought, for the first time in a long time, that I might actually be all right. The night before the trial, I could not sit still. I had been calm for days, a deliberate, constructed calm. The kind you build piece by piece out of preparation and routine and the decision not to think too far ahead. I had eaten well, slept adequately, kept to the schedule I had set for myself in those final weeks. I had done everything a man could do to be ready. And now it was the evening before the day itself, and the constructed calm had developed a crack in it that I could not repair by doing anything useful. because there was nothing useful left to do. Maggie had made dinner a simple meal, pasta and salad, nothing that required much effort, which told me she had been thinking about my stomach as well as everything else. She was still recovering from the fever, not entirely herself yet, moving a little more carefully than usual. But she had insisted on cooking, and I had learned long ago which battles with Maggie were worth engaging and which ones were not. We ate at the kitchen table with the overhead light on, and the March evening settling dark and cold outside the windows. We talked about ordinary things. The neighbor's dog that had been barking at odd hours. The forsythia at the side of the house that was beginning to show the first yellow at the tips of its branches. The earliest sign of a season that was still mostly theoretical. Maggie mentioned that she had been thinking about what to plant in the back garden this year, whether it was time to try tomatoes again after the disappointing results of the past 2 summers. I cannot tell you how grateful I was for that conversation. The pure, ordinary texture of it. The forsythia and the tomatoes and the neighbor's dog. The fact that Maggie understood without my having to ask. That what I needed that evening was not a strategy session, or a pep talk, or a solemn acknowledgement of the weight of the following day. What I needed was dinner at the kitchen table with my wife talking about things that had nothing to do with Marion County Circuit Court. After dinner, I washed the dishes, and she dried them. The way we have done since we were young, and the dishwasher broke one winter, and we never quite got back to using it as a first resort. We did not talk much during the dishes. The radio was on low, an oldies station that Maggie likes. The kind that plays songs from the 60s and 70s that I never paid much attention to when they were current and have somehow become deeply familiar in the years since. When the dishes were done, I went to the living room and sat in my armchair for a while, not reading, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting with the lamp on and the house quiet around me. Maggie came in after a while and sat in her chair across the room with her book. And we were in that room together, the way we had been in rooms together for 38 years, not always talking, not always doing the same thing, but present to each other in a way that required no maintenance and no performance. At some point, she looked up from her book and said, "You should try to sleep at a reasonable hour tonight." I said I would try. She said, "Arthur," I said. "I know." She went upstairs around 9:30. I heard her moving around in the bedroom above me, the familiar small sounds of a person settling in for the night. And then the house was quiet. I stayed in the armchair for a while longer. Then I got up and went to the kitchen. The kitchen at night has always been my room. I do not know exactly when that became true, but somewhere in the years of living in this house it happened. The kitchen became the place where I go when I cannot sleep, when I have something to work out, when the rest of the house feels too far from wherever I actually am. It is not a remarkable kitchen. White cabinets, linoleum floor that we keep meaning to replace, a window above the sink that looks out over the backyard and the bare tree where the early birds had been sitting that Wednesday morning when I read my closing argument aloud to no one. I sat down at the table. The cardboard box was there, as it had been for months now, though it no longer held the same weight it once had. Most of its contents had been submitted to the court, catalogued and labeled and organized into the official record of Callaway versus Mast, or Mast versus Callaway, as the filing had it, though in my mind, I had always thought of it the other way. The box itself was nearly empty now, a few duplicate copies, some notes I had made in the early weeks, the folder with the memo in it, which I had kept a copy of because I could not quite bring myself to let it out of my possession entirely, as if having it near me was a form of insurance against the possibility that I had imagined it. I did not open the box. I just sat with it there in front of me. The way I had sat with it on that first October night, when I had pulled it down from the garage shelf and set it on this table and looked at it, and knew that whatever came next was going to be the hardest thing I had done. I had been right about that. It had been the hardest thing, not in the way I expected, though I had expected the hardest part to be the legal work, the learning of a language I had never spoken, the standing in a courtroom without anyone beside me who knew what they were doing. Those things had been hard, but they had been the kind of hard that responds to effort, that retreats in the face of preparation and persistence and sufficient yellow legal pads. The other kind of hard does not respond to effort, the kind that lives in a father's chest when his son shakes his hand at the door instead of embracing him, the kind that lives in a husband's chest when his wife sells her mother's candlesticks and says it is already settled, no discussion needed, the kind that lives in a man of 65 when he understands, fully and without the cushion of distraction, that the life he is living is not the life he imagined he was building, and never entirely was. I sat with all of that in the kitchen at 11 o'clock on the night before the trial. I thought about the building on East Washington Street, standing in the dark of a March night in Indianapolis, doing what it was built to do. I thought about the soil beneath it, the eastern foundation I had redesigned 15 years ago in the face of conditions that required redesigning, and how that decision made correctly, documented properly, made with nothing in mind except what the engineering required, had become the center of a story that had consumed 7 months of my life. I had not done anything wrong. I knew that. I had known it from the beginning. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and having it confirmed by the world. And I was aware that tomorrow the world was going to weigh in. And the world does not always land on the side of what is true. I thought about that. I sat with the possibility of losing. Not with panic. The panic had been there in the early weeks and had gradually been replaced by something more sustainable, but with honest acknowledgement. If Judge Hartley looked at the evidence and saw something different from what I saw, if Gerald's version of events was persuasive enough to carry the day despite the memo and the documentation and 41 years of professional record, then I would lose. The retirement account would be at risk. The house might follow. The life that Maggie and I had built over 38 years of careful and honest living would be diminished in ways that could not be entirely repaired. I sat with that for a while, and then, slowly, I set it down. Not because it was not real, because carrying it into that courtroom tomorrow was not going to help me, and leaving it here on the kitchen table, in the quiet of the house, was the only thing I could do with it tonight. I heard Maggie on the stairs at 11:30. She had been awake then, or had not yet fallen asleep. I was not surprised. She moved through the kitchen doorway in her old green cardigan and her slippers, her hair loose, and she took one look at me sitting at the table with the box in front of me and went directly to the stove without saying anything. She put the kettle on. She got 2 mugs from the cabinet above the sink. She moved around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has been making tea in the same kitchen for 31 years and could do it in complete darkness without inconveniencing herself or anyone else. She set a mug in front of me and sat down across the table. We did not speak for a while. The tea was warm between my hands. The kitchen held us the way it always had, close and ordinary and without judgment. The light above the table casting everything in that familiar late-night yellow that had become, over these past months, the color of the hardest and most honest hours of my life. After a while, Maggie looked at the box and then at me and said, "Are you ready?" I thought about the question. Not the automatic version of it, not the version that produces the reflexive response of yes, Of course. Fine. I actually thought about it. I said, I think so. I think I have done everything I could do. She said, You have. I watched you do it. I looked at her across the table. The 38 years of her. The green cardigan and the gray eyes and the steady, particular way she had of looking at me that had never changed. Not in 38 years. Not through the raising of 3 children and the losing of her parents, and the 10,000 ordinary difficulties of a shared life, and the 7 extraordinary months just past. She had looked at me with that same steadiness on the night we met at a party in Broad Ripple in 1984. A young woman who had not yet decided what she thought of me. And she had looked at me with it when we stood in front of a minister in the spring of '86. And she had looked at me with it across this same table on 100 nights when I had come home from work with the weight of other problems and needed somewhere to set them down. I said, I don't know what I would have done without you through all of this. She said, You would have managed. I said, No, I wouldn't have. She did not argue with me about that, which meant she knew I was right. I said, After this is over, whatever happens tomorrow, I want to do things differently. I want to pay better attention. I have been paying attention to problems for 41 years, and not enough attention to the right things. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Arthur, you have been paying attention. You just express it differently than some people do. I have always known that. I said, I know you have. That's the thing. You have always known, and I have not always made it easy to know. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, Well, we have time to do things better. That is the advantage of still being here. Still being here. I turned that over in my mind, the way you turn something simple over and find that it is not simple at all, that it contains more than its surface suggests. Still being here. On the night before a trial that could cost us everything we had saved, in a house in Indianapolis in March, with the forsythia just beginning at the side of the house and the tomatoes still theoretical, and 38 years of a shared life on the table between us. Still being here was, in fact, everything. We sat for a long time after that. The tea cooled. The street outside was empty and dark. The particular deep quiet of a weeknight in a residential neighborhood in the small hours. The kind of quiet that makes the world feel very large and very small at the same time. I thought about Daniel. I let myself think about him fully, without setting it aside. He was my son, and he had failed me, and he did not entirely know the shape of what he had done. And tomorrow, when I walked into that courtroom, he would not be there, and the seat behind me would be empty. And I would carry that the way a man carries something he did not choose and cannot put down. But I would carry it, and I would walk in, and I would say what I had prepared to say, and I would do it for myself and for Maggie, and for 41 years of work that deserved to be defended by someone who knew its value. I thought about what came after. Not the verdict that was tomorrow's question, and tonight was not the night for it. I thought about the morning, getting up, putting on the suit I had pressed and hung on the back of the bedroom door, eating something, probably toast, probably not tasting it, driving to Delaware Street in the early morning light, finding the parking garage, walking into that building with the high ceilings and the marble floors that made every footstep sound like a declaration, standing up and telling the truth. That was all it was, in the end. Standing up and telling the truth in a room full of people, and trusting that the truth was enough, and accepting that you could not control whether it was received the way it deserved to be received. only whether you delivered it the way it deserved to be delivered. I had done the work. I had gone through every document in that box. I had sat in the library for weeks and learned a language I had never spoken. I had stood in my living room and practiced until the words came out the way Maggie said they should, not like a contract, not like a report, but like a man talking. I had filed everything on time and in the correct form. I had found the memo that Gerald Mast had apparently forgotten he had ever written and submitted it to the court, and prepared the argument that would put it in front of a judge in the morning. I had done everything a man could do. Maggie reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She did not say anything. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said or understood or simply lived. The way long marriages do their most important communicating, not in conversations, but in the accumulated weight of presence, in the hand across the table at 11:30, on the night before the hardest day. I turned my hand over and held hers. Outside, Indianapolis was quiet. The March sky pressed down dark and wide over the city, over the courthouse on Delaware Street, over the building on East Washington Street that had stood for 15 years on the foundation I had correctly designed, over this house on this street where Maggie and I had lived for 31 years, and where we were sitting now in the kitchen light, holding hands across a kitchen table with a nearly empty cardboard box between us. I did not know what tomorrow would bring. I had made my peace with not knowing. What I knew was this: I had not done anything wrong. I had a wife who had not left. I had done the work. And in the morning, I was going to stand up in a room and say so. I turned off the kitchen light. We went upstairs together, Maggie and I, in the dark of our house, and I lay down and closed my eyes. And for the first time in 7 months, I slept. If this story found you tonight, I want you to know that I am grateful. Truly. There is something about sharing a hard chapter of your life with strangers who listen with open hearts that I did not expect to feel the way I feel it. Thank you for sitting with me through all of it. The box on the kitchen table, the courtroom, the candlesticks, the quiet nights. If this story meant something to you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need it. A like, a subscription, a kind word passed along, those things matter more than you might think. To the people who make these stories and to the people who need to hear them, God bless you. And whatever hard thing you are carrying tonight, I hope you find someone to sit with you in the kitchen light.